Welcome to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Whether you're 25 or 45, there's bound to be a discussion that you care about. Our mission is to share practical ways to find God in your everyday life. And now today's host, Chris Lang.
In the world we live in, the dizzying pace of development and progress can sometimes cause us to devalue history as less important than the latest fad or scientific theory. The concept of evolution is only about 200 years old, arising around the time when new inventions began to change this world. Are there some aspects of evolution that Christians can ascribe to and still be faithful to the Bible? Or is a combination of the two a slippery slope that could lead us away from faith in a God that can recreate or create anything, including our hearts? Hello, I'm Chris Lang, and I'll be your host today on this program called Half Salutes to Evolution. I want to introduce the guests on my program today. With me, as always, I appreciate working with Rick Mann, my co-host today. Welcome, Rick.
Glad to be here.
And our special guest, again, joining us this season, Dr. David Gentry from Knoxville, Tennessee, currently finishing your residency in nuclear medicine, and joining us from Knoxville, Tennessee. Welcome, Dave.
Glad to be here, Chris.
You know, you and your father have worked together for years using experiments in science to prove the creation story of the Bible. By the way, if any of you missed the two programs called Creation Science that were aired on Hope on Fire, we encourage you to go to our website, and there you can download either an audio or video version of the programs that Rick hosted with Dr. Gentry here in a previous broadcast. And Dave, it's just great to have you here. I want to jump right into this. The whole aspect of history, you know, people don't realize that evolution and atheism itself really kind of came out about the same period of Earth's history when people were basically rejecting the concept of whatever Christianity was presented to them around the turn of the 1800s. And I wonder, you know, with this birth of enlightenment and technology and everything that changed the world, what is it that Christians are doing now to maybe encroach on this idea or some parts of evolution? It seems that there are many different aspects, and we want to talk of a few of them today. And I'm just wondering what your thinking is on how evolution even got started to begin with.
Well, you know, the pressure is on for Christians today to accept parts of evolution. Now, the popular thing to do today now is to take aspects of evolution, which are palatable to the religious aspects of creation, and blend them together in a sort of mix that will seem to pass the taste of many of the people that you know, we all know and come in contact with, both in secular walks of life and in the church. And I think it's one of the most distressing things for me to see these things that are embraced from evolution being incorporated in creation models, which really don't have the sound fundamental basis any more than a straight belief in God, that God created the earth in a literal sense 6,000 years ago.
Okay, we're going to get into breaking down these three major, as you called it, half salutes to evolution that Christians are making. Starting off with the first one, which you just referenced, is a literal creation in 7 days, but something was here before God spoke it into existence, right?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I've always kind of ascribed to that theory. And the reason is, and I want to step back for a second, play devil's advocate here. Can you blame people to want to try to mix in the scientific with the faith-based? I mean, you look at the world, and these people are adamant. Like, you know, they mock Christians in our beliefs, and obviously we want to be accepted. We want to say, wait a minute, no, there is scientific backing to what we believe. And so, at least for me, not because I have any kind of grand knowledge, but I've always kind of thought, well, maybe the reason why when we date these rocks that they're millions and millions of years old is because the Earth was without form and void for millions and millions of years before God kind of stepped up and molded maybe a blank slate or this mound of clay that was the Earth. You know,
well, and maybe we should back up one step and simply affirm those who in the early 1800s started to reject a God who, through the bloodshed of the organized church of that day, was massacring millions of people because they didn't believe in all of the established truth as it was preached from the pulpit. Can we blame people when they were given a picture of a God who could allow such atrocities?
Right.
So the whole dawn of evolution, in a way, was just this response to a God that could not be trusted or believed in at all. So using that as a fundamental basis, we have now Christianity, who's got a role in this to say, are there parts, as you said, are there parts of this that can still be part of our faith? And that's kind of, I think, getting into this first aspect. It's the closest to the real creation story, isn't it not? Is it not? And what are the dangers in saying the earth was already there, null and void, as it says in Genesis 1?
Well, I think that the danger is that anytime we accept something which does not have a fundamental sound basis in the Bible, we're going down a dangerous road. I can't sit here and tell you today what all the different dangers might be. I don't know. But I do know that if we take the Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 and say that verse alone can support a theory that the earth has been here for billions of years, we're running on dangerous ground. Now, furthermore, one of the reasons why I came down here, of course, and one of the reasons why you wanted me to be on this show is to talk about what are some of the scientific evidences that we have for a young earth.
Yeah.
Do we have independent evidence that the earth is actually young, which would support a biblical model? And I would like to say, yes, we do. We do have concrete evidence, which if you look at, for instance...
there's two key pieces that we want to review here, right?
There are two key pieces. Actually, I want to just briefly touch on three. The first one we talked about in the show last fall, and that was the...
Creation Science Part 1, I believe.
The polonium halo evidence. That basically attacks the fundamental... view that granite rock, the rock that forms the foundation of all the continents, formed over millions of years, cooled slowly. If you take a geology class in any university, you'll find that the igneous rocks are rocks which are theorized to have formed slowly over the vast ages of Earth history. Okay. Billions of years, that these rocks cooled and slowly crystallized. Okay. Within those rocks, however, are tiny pieces of evidence that those rocks did not crystallize slowly over long periods of time, but crystallized rather rapidly. Okay. But the question is, in which some people have brought out, how do you know that instantaneous cooling of the rock which you have, the polonium halos, to briefly summarize again, it speaks of a way, or it talks about a way of how did the rock cool quickly enough for the polonium halos to develop, because in order for the polonium halos...
And there's actually a substance that remains in the rock that could only be there if the rock cooled rapidly.
Rapidly, exactly.
To conserve some kind of element in the rock.
Exactly. If the implantation of the polonium isotope, in this case polonium-218, occurred and the rock was molten for, even 100 years, much less hundreds of thousands or millions of years, that element would be gone.
Okay.
And so what we need is a scientific model to explain how that rock could form and crystallize almost instantaneously around that that radio center, so that the record of that radioactive decay could be captured in the rock. Of course, the picture of a halo is on the cover of my dad's book, and that gives a visual illustration of what we're dealing with. But again, it doesn't necessarily lock in an age. Some people that believe in the Bible that say, well, God must have created the earth all at once, but he did it several billion years ago.
Okay, let's talk about that. We had an email from a viewer who saw the programs that we did in the last season, which are on our website. And he asked a question about that. He said, okay, fine. So God creates these rocks and then cools them quickly, but let's say that it happened twice, and these elements are frozen into the rock. How do you know what era they were actually created in? You have a second element of research that verifies when potentially, or not more than potentially, but pretty much gives an age of the rock, doesn't it?
It does. It actually puts an upper limit on what the absolute
potential age
of the rock could be. Now, that is the differential retention of helium in zircons, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. But first, I just want to bring up very briefly that halos have also been found in samples of coalified wood in the Colorado Plateau. Now, what's the significance of that? The significance of that is in 1976, my dad published a paper in the journal Science, and in that paper, he outlined that the ratios of uranium-238 to lead-206, which were found in the centers of the radio centers of these coalified wood halos, these uranium halos, was actually too high to be accounted for from an evolutionary perspective. In that paper, a copy of which is before me here, he says basically the following, that the ratio, the uranium-238 to lead-206 ratio of 27,300, which is the exact value that he found, is indicative of the formation time of the radio center, which is more recent by at least a factor of 270 than the minimum geologic age, and the maximum estimated age, which is the Triassic geologic age, for the introduction of the uranium into these logs. Now,
what does that mean for a layperson?
For a layperson, basically what that means is this: we have found uranium radio centers active in these halo sites in the Colorado Plateau, which is much more active than what would be accountable for if these rock formations were indeed hundreds of millions of years old. In fact, there are several orders of magnitude higher, of the order of hundreds of magnitudes of order higher.
So let's boil this down real quick before the break. We're talking about the more helium there is in a rock or on a piece of wood, coalified wood, right? The more helium there is, the younger the age of that.
Well, in the case of the coalified wood, yes, it's actually the more radioactive uranium. In the case of the zircons, there's actually more helium. The helium there was actually helium cores
inside the rock.
Granite cores taken in a deep drill hole at various levels below the Earth's surface. And in each of those granite cores, zircons were extracted, and the helium was boiled away by mass spectrometer and measured the amount. And then that amount measured was compared with the theoretical value, which would be there if the Earth had been millions of years old. And they were much, much higher than would be expected.
The levels were much higher than what would have been.
Exactly.
So that then is the other piece that maybe our viewers missed in the first program that you guys did together, and that is, one, there was a quick cooling of a rock. And the second piece then was that there was more helium in the rock, which shows that the rock itself is much younger. It's not billions of years old.
Absolutely.
It's in the order of thousands of years old.
Absolutely.
Right?
Geophysical Research Letters, October 1982 was the particular issue that this article came out in. And I would like to submit that the age of those rock formations is more consistent with a several thousand-year age than a several million-year age. You combine that with the evidence for creation in the polonium halos, and you have solid evidence for creation.
Good. Well, we hope you all will stay with us and continue our education process in the age of the Earth. This is Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. I'm Chris Lang, your host today, and we were talking here today about half-salutes to evolution. And here in the studio today is Dr. David Gentry and my co-host Rick Mann. Welcome back, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Want to get back to, we covered some incredible scientific evidence that backs up the biblical model of a literal 7-day, the age of the Earth, which would back up the idea that the Earth must not be older than thousands of years old, right?
Well, I think that goes back to our half salute. The first one that we were discussing was the fact that maybe the Earth was here for a very long time, and in my mind, I kind of envisioned this, no star, no sun, and just this rock with water on it or clouds or whatever, because it says it was without form and void and it was dark. So I just kind of assumed that God stepped in after these things were kind of melded together, and he created the sun and the moon and did his thing and made land and went and at that point a literal 7-day. But this gets against the whole idea of a young Earth.
Well, and the bedrock, the idea that the bedrock was there prior to a literal 7-day creation, it's not a small amount of Christians that believe that.
Right.
There's a lot of Christians who take this view based on that verse in Scripture. Dave, you made a good point, though. The Bible is very clear that in Psalms, you've quoted many Scriptures that
Psalm 33, 6 and 9, for, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. It speaks to the rapidity of the creation event. God speaking matter into existence. In Hebrews chapter 1, we read, by faith, the worlds were framed so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear.
Wow. In other words, God didn't take billions of years to do his thing. And that kind of, we're going to get back to the spiritual implications of the creation story. But that first half salute is significant. I think the research in the first half of this program bears out that those rocks couldn't have been sitting there for millions or billions of years based on the scientific research. Second half salute. Creation story is true, but not to be taken literally. Now, there's a fair share of Christians out there who believe that there's a God out there who, over billions of years, just sort of, there's an evolutionary topic that is used, theistic evolution, where there's a God, there's a creator, but it wasn't a literal creation week. What are your thoughts on that? What are the challenges and the dangers in that for Christians?
Exodus 20, the fourth commandment, hammers home the point that for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. God gave the 10 Commandments to the Hebrews on Mount Sinai as a literal representation of his character, his law that he gave to them. He gave them the 7-day week. He said, I want you to work 6 days. I want you to rest the seventh day. Just as I created the world in 6 days and rested the seventh day, I want you to work 6 days and rest 1 day.
Because that'd be very interesting, because if God took millions of years and that's what a day meant, I would really like to find that that 2 million year period where I don't have to work anymore. So if you could let me know when that is, that'd be great.
It's a Jubilee period.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
if we're Christians and we want the Bible to explain itself, if we let the Bible interpret itself, we use the same meaning for day in Genesis as we do in Exodus.
I hear you.
And it just totally takes out the theory that the earth was made over long geological periods.
Okay, let's talk about the implications quickly for those who believe in this concept. A couple things came to mind in my estimation. One is you mentioned the Sabbath commandment, which, by the way, is the only commandment that starts with remember. Remember the Sabbath day. It was not the first time that suddenly the God's people heard about a Sabbath. It was created at the creation week. So the one thing is the literal 24 hours of the holy Sabbath that God sanctified is debunked if you believe in a theistic evolution. Secondly, evolution has a concept of survival of the fittest. If God had a hand in just letting things go with that concept, he's got blood on his hands, doesn't he? Isn't he responsible for the gore and all the death and dying through this survival of the fittest?
Well, it makes a very impersonal God, in my opinion. I mean, what that does
Unplugged?
Unplugged. It's like, well, I'm going to just set it off and I'll come back. And because you have to think about that. That's what it happened. If you believe that God set it off and everything, happened, and then he just happened to pop back in and send Jesus down. I mean, you know what I mean? Or just pop in, with the Israelites or whatever.
Right,
and it really, that's not the kind of God that I want to be. That's a very impersonal God.
Depersonalizes it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the third half salute now, and it's probably got more press than the others. Intelligent design. This is kind of a spin-off theory from what I can understand, and you guys can help clarify my thinking. But one of the things that kind of struck me is that we've seen this idea that God is kind of a impersonal, ethereal, something out there. What are your thoughts on the danger of Christians who think that maybe this is a good way to start witnessing to secular-minded, postmodern people?
Well, from my standpoint, again, it totally depersonalizes a God that wants to be part of your life. And if you start down that road, that's what you're stuck with. You can't. How do you bridge that with saying, you know what, Jesus came down and died for you, and he wants to have a relationship with you? When you before that say, well, now he does, but 5 million years ago he really didn't care. All he did was go, and then that was it. For me, you can't go from point A to point B from intelligent design to a personal God and be credible at that point.
It's difficult. If you just tell somebody, there's an intelligence in the universe that created all this, of course, that's good because you think in a way, well, that gets people thinking about God, but not necessarily. Some people won't make that leap in logic and say, well, the intelligent design must mean God. In fact, I think that
talk about singularity.
I think it's actually
concept.
too close to what evolutionists do themselves. And what evolutionists do is actually a very interesting thing. They will take a theory, for instance, the Big Bang, the standard model of the creation of the universe, where 20 billion years ago, a primeval atom exploded and expanded at an incredibly rapid rate and filled the universe with matter. What was the instigating event of that Big Bang? It's what scientists call a singularity. What is a singularity? A singularity is nothing more than what a Christian calls miracle. A singularity is where the laws of science break down. And when the laws of science break down, you have what scientists cannot explain by any science, by any scientific method. But the thing that's different, that makes a singularity more palatable to scientists than a miracle, is that there's a missing element, and that missing element is God. If you take the theory of evolution and you inject into it singularities at needed points to explain your model, that's okay, and you're still conforming to the scientific method.
Does it take faith?
It does take faith, but they're okay with that because it doesn't incorporate God.
Right.
If you want to say that God is the origin, is the cause of the creation, then that pulls in a whole new dimension to this, and they don't want that dimension.
And that's why we're calling this a half salute, aren't we? Mm-hmm. Because in a way, you're half saluting evolution by saying intelligent design, but yet it doesn't have a name.
It doesn't
have a personhood. It doesn't have a heart that wants to have a relationship.
We're nodding to the evolution and saying, okay, we won't talk about God either. But we are going to talk about God, and we are going to bring up God. I'm not ashamed of it. And I think you can be 100% scientist and 100% belief in God and pull God into your theories. Why? Because even the most atheistic scientist out there pulls in a singularity into his theory to make it work, and I'm not going to apologize for bringing God into my theory to make my theory work. Mm-hmm. There's just no two ways about it.
You know, this idea of intelligent design is not a new phenomenon. When the Apostle Paul was in Greece, he basically was trying to reason with the philosophers and scientists of the day, and they had an altar to the unknown God. This is in Acts chapter 17. And he basically noticed they were religious people. And among the many gods they worshiped, there was this altar to the unknown God. And he basically challenged them that God was closer to them than they realized. Mm-hmm. And that he was the reason for all things created. And so God says, come let us reason together. And there's science and religion don't have to be mutually exclusive. And that's what I'm hearing from your heart. Let's get into maybe one of the most famous scientists that ever lived. And I'm fascinated by a new book that just came out on the life of Albert Einstein. And basically, I'm not going to go through all of this because we don't have time, but essentially he said he believed in Jesus Christ, that he, not as a Christian, but he believed that he was a historical figure in the Earth's history. And secondly, that he believed in God. That he was not an atheist. He was very adamant about that. And he said it's kind of like being a child in a library with books written in different languages. And this is humanity's response, he says, to a cosmos that we don't understand. It's the laws in a language we can't speak. Mm-hmm. So, Rick, you have a question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when we look at this, and I talked about this when we had our show last season, you know, I want just something to happen. I just want God to come down and be real and give unrefutable evidence that he is there. And do you really think that's ever going to happen? Is that something we can rely on or ever expect? Or
Well, you know, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that question. Will God ever prove his existence through science the way a scientist would want him to prove it? I don't know. But you know what? We can go to the Bible. We can go to the Bible and look at examples of how God...
And we have just 1 minute left. So give us a summary of the biblical evidence that God will show up with evidence before he comes back.
Well, we look at the Bible, we see evidences in the when God interacted in the lives of the Israelites in ancient Egypt. He gave the Pharaoh evidence after evidence after evidence that he was dealing with God. He did that to show Pharaoh that he was God and that the Israelites were going to go.
Before the final judgment of the young people being killed, mm-hmm. Which was not God's will. What about Noah and the ark?
What about Noah and the ark? God finally, you know, right before the flood came, God sent an angel to lead the animals into the ark.
Can you imagine?
It was a miracle.
Yeah.
And, so the animals going in the ark was a great testimony to the antediluvians to say, there's something going on here. God gave them that evidence. And then, of course, the crowning evidence that Jesus gave in his ministry here on earth. That Jesus reserved the crowning miracle of his whole entire ministry toward the beginning or the end of his ministry.
Towards the end.
Toward the end. He performed the greatest miracle at the end when he raised Lazarus from the dead. In fact, he said, you won't believe even if somebody's raised from the dead. But in fact, somebody was raised from the dead. And so that's what worries me about God giving indisputable evidence, because history says that even when God does give indisputable evidence, raising the Lazarus from the dead, sending the animals into the ark, that people will still harden their hearts and reject the truth.
There's so much we could talk about, guys. I want to thank you guys for being with me today. In Acts 17:27, the Apostle Paul states that God's purpose in creation was that we should seek after him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our sense of identity or purpose. In the end, whatever we believe, when it can't be measured, it takes faith. When believers take rest in the reality of the biblical worldview of a loving Creator God, we can and will influence others to taste and see that the Lord is good. What are we waiting for? I hope you've been blessed by our program today. Thanks to to Rick and to Dave. God bless you all.
Hope on Fire is produced by Lifestreams Media, a listener-supported ministry. To download a free copy of today's program or be a part of our social network, please visit our website at hopeonfire.org. You may also contact us by writing to Lifestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860. Once again, that's Lifestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860, or online at hopeonfire.org. Thank you so much for your letters and continued support. Until next time, may God set your hope on fire.